Dit is maandag die 25ste Maart. Ek glo jy het 'n lekker lang naweek gehad en dan is daar nou nog 'n lang naweek om na uit te sien. So ons gaan aan met The Long Lost Grave. Hi darling, hi. Kathy raised herself lazily on one elbow, dreamily staring at Rob while her free hand absently traced through the dark hair on his chest, and she sighed happily. I can wake up like this forever, she mused through this disarray of wild hair that hung down her forehead, over her eyes and cheeks. Rob reached over and with one finger gently tucked the hair away. Lying on his back in her bed, he watched her with deep contentment. He was smiling fondly as he ran his finger down the side of her face. I must admit, he replied, grinning, that I too prefer waking up like this. He sighed dramatically. There is no romance in being a bachelor, and only loneliness in being a spinster. She giggled softly, which he found irresistible, and he leaned across. She kissed his lips. I am glad those sharks popped up yesterday, he mumbled. Otherwise, I might have woken up in that tent over there, all alone and cold. My poor man, no need to fear that anymore. She smiled tenderly. But what about Herbie? Herbie is all right. He knows about us, or at least he suspects it, and he will understand. She nodded, satisfied, and rolled on her stomach, staring at him. You know, I've never been so afraid in all my life as yesterday. I was absolutely terrified. I felt so weak and terrified, and if it hadn't been for you and Herbie, her voice faltered. It's all right now, Kathy, he whispered. It's okay now. Yes, and when we came here, I needed you. I tried to be strong all on my own, but if you hadn't come for me, Rob chuckled. That's a pretty way of putting it, lady. In fact, I think I need you even more. When I thought about what had happened and just how close our escape had been, I was as shaky as you were. That was when I walked into the shower. But you didn't look afraid. Oh, but I was. All people are afraid when faced with danger, but the trick is to control it. Once one can do that, it can actually help you. It's a beautiful day, Kathy later said as they sat facing each other on her bed drinking coffee. It started right, Rob agreed with a grin and awkwardly fumbled with one hand for a cigarette. He looked at her seriously. Are you up to any diving today? She hesitantly lowered her cup. I don't know. The idea is a bit scary at the moment, but then again, I will always be scared until I have died again. So let's give it a go, if you're happy with it. That's true. We both have to dive again to rid of the fear, even if it is only for a short while. I will go and have a look at the weather while you rinse the cups. He stood up and kissed her before sauntering out, and she watched him with a song in her heart. Outside on the stoop, still smoking, he squinted his eyes against the bright morning glare and stared happily out over the calm sea. It was a terrific day, a day so quiet, beautiful and peaceful that it matched his mood in every sense of the word. The sky was clear and blue in the bright morning. The sea was flat, unnaturally bright blue, and the waves that stood up close to the shore roared in their endless fashion of white spray high over the rocks. A misty haze hung sky, and even at this hour Rob could tell that it was going to be a magnificent day. A perfect summer's day, he thought as he filled his lungs with the fresh air and casually glanced towards the river mouth. He froze. The Flying Dutchman was gone. Surprised, He searched around, looking towards Plettenberg Bay, but saw nothing. There was no sign of either the boat or old Jos. "Cathy!" he called, alarmed. "What's the matter?" she called back, came to the door and saw the expression on his face. "Did Uncle Jos say anything about going back to the harbour?" "No, nothing. He was still there when we walked on the rocks last night, remember?" Rob nodded, and a terrible sense of foreboding became over him. Next to him, Cathy searched the ocean vainly with one hand above the eyes, shielding the sun away. He said nothing. He must have left some time during the night, back to Plet, perhaps. Her voice trailed off as she slowly turned to him. "Rob, you don't think something is wrong, Cathy? I'm going up along the coast," he said sharply. "You get on the telephone and find out whether he's in the harbour or not, or if anyone has seen him. And get Herbie." She nodded, a thick lump in her throat. "I will phone right away. You go, I will catch up later." She hurried back into the rondavel to phone the harbour. Rob just took the time to don his pair of runners. He left at a run and settled into the steady pace once he reached the road that led to the suspension bridge. While he ran, he quietly prayed that his fears were unfounded and that something might have forced the old man back to the harbour. But no matter how he reasoned, he couldn't find reason enough for the old man to just abandon the spot and return to Plet without a word. No, something had to be wrong. The suspension bridge swayed and dipped as he ran across. Just as he reached the eastern side, he saw the first piece of floating wood. Then he saw the masses of darbies on the surface of the river close to the shore. He began to run faster along the footpath, above and behind the rocks until his breath rasped through his open mouth, and all along the shoreline were thousands of pieces of smashed wooden planks, some still drifting, although most had been washed high upon and in between the rocks by the high tide. Stunned, he stopped and stared with misty eyes at the heap of rubble in the crevice below. There was no doubt. The blue and white painted mast lay wedged between the rocks, mist and entanglement of ropes, kelp and seaweed. All around the rocks, his eyes were met by the same scene: shattered planks, ropes, unrecognizable pieces of wreckage, and tattered remnants of clothes. "Josh, oh no, what happened?" Rob sank onto his knees, shocked. Why did he leave the old man aboard? Why did he allow Jos to stay on the boat? Why did he not take the precautions against anything like this? Even in the turmoil of his thoughts, he knew that although he should have had, he could not have foreseen such a disaster. What had happened? He heard old Jos's voice again, reverberating hollowly through his head. So far, no lives were lost. They won't stop at murder. None of us will be safe. This treasure is still going to draw blood. Rob wanted to choke in his grief. The wrong man had died. An innocent old man who wanted no part of the gold had died here with his boat. Tears ran down his cheeks as he saw the cheerful, wizened old face with the ever-present pipe. The man who had saved his life barely a day ago had died on the rocks alone, and he could have prevented it. There was no hate or anger, not at that moment. He only felt emptiness, a feeling of an irreplaceable loss, a great remorse and regret. His heart was heavy as he sat staring out over the incoming breakers. Jos was dead, and it was his fault. Herbie found him first. Neither spoke. Both had liked the old man. but Herbie had worked with him on the deck, and the younger brother's eyes were clouded with a suppressed anger. "I will kill them for this." "You think they did it?" "Who else? Hell, Rob, this was no accident. You had dropped the anchor yourself, and that was a 30mm nylon rope. No way could it have broken, not in this weather." He was right, of course. That anchor and rope could have held a boat twice the size of the Flying Dutchman with ease. And in this weather? Hell no, Rob thought with rising displeasure. Uncle Jos was set adrift deliberately. He was murdered. None of them were safe. "We have to sort this out, Herbie, one way or another. We owe Uncle Jos at least that." Cathy and Warden Opperman arrived amidst a group of curious bystanders who had somehow heard or guessed that something was out of the ordinary. Cathy had used a few moments to slip into her uniform after making various calls, and now she was talking sternly to the growing number of onlookers, warning them to stay clear of the rocks and wreckage and not to leave the footpath. Warden Opperman, meanwhile, conferred with Rob and Herbie, who stood amongst a pile of wreckage. The police and members of the Sea Rescue Unit, warned by Cathy, arrived at that moment. Apart from the plain-clothed Lieutenant Murray, the police was represented by a Sergeant Verwysing, who turned out to be a distant cousin of the deceased. And while the two policemen performed their own on-the-spot investigation, a reporter from the local newspaper arrived on the scene, very much to the warden and Cathy's agitation. Cathy, making a striking figure in her ranger's uniform, was immediately the target of his curious questions. Questions which she was either reluctant or unable to answer. Old Jos had been her friend, and her sorrow was as deep as those of Rob and Herbie, with whom she had little contact since the discovery of the wreck. But between her duties as liaison officer with the press and curious public, a job which Warden Opperman had gladly left in her hands, she did notice the tension and anger on the faces of the two brothers. She knew them well enough to know that it meant trouble. She silently hoped that no one would annoy them. She was worried about Rob. She had sensed his feeling of guilt and could imagine his distress. She wished she could just leave everything and go to comfort him. Later, the few men gathered down below on the rocks when, much to their annoyance, Klaus Weber arrived with a profound bravado which seemed oddly out of place. "Well," Lieutenant Murray declared when the speculations had died away, "we haven't found the body yet, but the sea rescue team will continue the search ashore as well as offshore until we find the body or are at least certain that it won't be found. However, we must presume that the old man died here." He glanced around the circle for faces. "There is evidence that he wasn't home for many days now, and Mr. de Boer said they had left him aboard yesterday. So he must have been aboard when this happened." He paused briefly. "And what had happened is only guesswork at this stage, but I am fairly satisfied that it was an accident, that he died due to very uncomfortable, or unfortunate rather, accident." "You really believe that, Lieutenant?" Herbie asked abruptly, and Murray looked flustered. "Sure, what else?" he asked, and Sergeant Verwysing glanced sharply at Herbie, who stood watching the officer. "His boat was set adrift," Rob interjected dryly. Deliberately, that makes it murder." An appalled silence settled over them. "That's absurd and ridiculous." Klaus gave a hearty laugh. Everybody knows the old man's boat. It was a wreck and his painters old and worn out. Why, I believe I could have broken that anchor rope with my bare hands, he exaggerated. You seem awfully sure of your facts, Rob said acidly. When was the last time you were aboard her? Klaus fidgeted uncomfortably. Well, I haven't exactly been aboard recently, but I've watched it from close by. I know the boat. Not that one, Rob shook his head sadly. You could not have broken that rope. I dropped that anchor myself, and if anyone here knows it, then it's me. And that boat was as sturdy as the best in your shop. He paused significantly. But if we had retrieved the anchor and rope, it should still be there. Then we can all see whether it broke or was cut. But Murray and Verwysing were thoughtful. The accident theory was a bit dubious. What if Rob de Boer was right? Murder! And in the uncomfortable silence, Warden Opperman fidgeted with his watch. The sea rescue officer looked alarmed and Cathy pressed Rob's elbow, encouraging. Things seemed less uncomplicated, but Klaus stood firm on the accident idea. Why, we all know that the old man was a heavy drinker. He probably drank too much and did something stupid and ended up here. Now you just wait a minute, Sergeant Verwysing spoke sharply, angrily. He might have his drink from time to time, but no more than I do, and far less than you do. Murray held up his hands. Okay, everybody, calm down. There is certainly doubt as to what caused the accident, so the police will investigate. We will have divers down to find the anchor and search for any evidence that might help us to solve it. Until then, his voice was stern and commanding. We shall handle this as an accident. Nothing is to be said to the press or anyone at this stage. Is that clear? He eyed Cathy sternly. As you said, Lieutenant, she replied. After all, accidents do happen. And without another word, she turned her back with undisguised disgust and strode away to the anxiously waiting reporter. Klaus and Murray stared after her but said nothing. Rob de Boer was still within hearing distance and very definitely not in the mood for fun and jokes. His look of suspicion was mirrored on those of Herbie's and to a lesser degree Sergeant Verwysing's. Why was Klaus Weber so anxious that it should be accepted as an accident? But it didn't seem to bother the lieutenant, as he turned with a forced smile towards the warden. Where can we talk confidentially? He asked, in his refined voice, trying his best to hide his annoyance. My office will be the best for that, Warden Opperman answered and quietly wondered what the police officer had on his mind. Shall we go? Please. The impeccably dressed officer replied, I want this business cleared up as soon as possible. And the warden wondered how his cooperation could ensure that. With most of the people gone, Rob and Cathy quietly walked amongst the rocks, watching the sea pounding the rocky shore, sending high spurts of white water and spray into the sky. Absorbed in their own thoughts and sorrow, they hardly took notice of the few occasional drops. They wandered aimlessly over the rocks and among the derbies, searching for nothing in particular. It was then that Rob saw a bottle. Climbing down into the crevice, carefully avoiding the rushing water, he retrieved the transparent glass bottle. They stared at it. Somehow, miraculously, the bottle didn't break, but instead jammed in the crevice. Rob slowly turned it over in his hands. The label was gone, but on the screw cap was a small printed white horse. It left no doubt. It was the same bottle of White Horse whiskey which Gabby Wilson had taken to Jos the previous afternoon. Kathy glanced at him and then back to the bottle, and the same thought was in their minds. Was it possible that Klaus was right? Did Jos drink too much and mishandled the boat, accidentally wrecking it? I don't know, Rob answered her unspoken question, but I can't believe that he would have tried to do anything after he drank this last night. Well, neither do I. Rob unscrewed the cap and lifted the bottle to his lips. Now, Jos, he growled a toast as he handed it to Kathy. She took it hesitantly. I'm in uniform, and she lifted the bottle defiantly, a daring look on her face. To Jos, she panted. He poured the remainder of the whiskey on the rocks before tossing the empty bottle far out to sea, where it slowly filled with water and quietly sank to the bottom. In a way, they had seen the old man off. Let's go back, Rob said and took her hand. There is nothing more we can do. Quietly, without talking, they walked back to the footpath and crossed the suspension bridge. Only then did Kathy speak. Rob, I must get back to my office. A lot of things have come up today, and the warden would need me to sort it out, she said. Rob nodded understandingly. It's fine, he replied. Herbie and I also have things to do, and perhaps we'll go to town. See you tonight. He kissed her gently before she drove off, and he couldn't help to grin as the white Datsun departed with spinning wheels and a roaring engine. Ranger Moore was on duty again. Herbie looked up from his fishing tackle when Rob walked into the camp. Now what? He asked solemnly. Let's go to town and get drunk. Warden Opperman closed his office door and motioned Lieutenant Murray into an easy chair before easing his body and bulging stomach into his usual place behind the large mahogany desk. He was breathing a little fast and his face was flushed from the exercise. But it didn't seem to bother the warden as he observed the fancy-looking policeman. Well, Murray, how can the park and I be of service or help to you? Murray crossed his legs and thought for an instant or two before he spoke. First things first, he began carefully, choosing his words with care. It is fairly important that we find Mr. Visagi's body as well as that anchor, if it is there, and of course any other evidence which may help us in the investigation. He moved his hands, stressing his intentions. If the boat was set adrift as young Dubois suspects, then he must do all we can to bring the culprit to the fore. On the other hand, if it was an accident, then we must have all the evidence to clear away any doubt. That's why I think it's vitally important that we should get divers down as soon as possible. He paused a moment and cleared his throat. And I know just the right people for the job. I thought you planned to bring in police divers. Murray nodded empathetically. Hell, yeah, well, that was the original idea, but that will take time. The police divers will have to come from as far as Cape Town or even the Transvaal. The Port Elizabeth contingent was barely enough men to cope with their own responsibilities. And right now there is a very well-equipped and keen group of men right here in Plettenberg Bay who can and will do it for free. The warden grimaced wryly. Dr. Gordon Forbes? You have heard then. I know about them, but please continue, Lieutenant. Well, as I've said, they are there and waiting. They can be in position by nightfall. We can have this whole business sorted out quickly and without hassle. in exchange for... Murray shifted uneasily. This was the moment. To stay there for an unlimited time, he said quietly. Why? You know what Visagi's boat was doing there? And when the warden nodded, he continued. Well, they too want to dive on the wreck. Casper Opperman stared at the officer across the large desk, contemplating the expected. He vividly thought of the enthusiastic efforts by the De Boer brothers and Cathy, now ruined by the accident. What would be the implications? But if he allowed Gordon Forbes in, what would the implications be if he allowed Gordon Forbes in? How would it affect Rob and Herbie? And did Gordon Forbes have anything to do with the previous night's accident? Murray's reasons for solving the mystery sounded good. To use the divers was logical. Instead of asking Gordon Forbes, Opperman cautiously probed, why not use the De Boer brothers for the search? Because, Murray leaned forward as he seriously replied, they lost almost all their equipment with the boat. I have considered them, but then I overheard them talking about their loss. They cannot continue, even if they wanted to. It was just the right answer, for he immediately saw the changed expression in the warden's eyes. Gordon Forbes and his men won't disturb anybody or anything. They won't even pass through these gates, and I am certain that he will even allow De Boer to share his facilities, he added with growing confidence. Warden Opperman stood up abruptly and turned to the open window, staring out into the beautiful sunshine day. Well, well, he said after a while, but not for an unlimited time. De Boer has permission to work and dive here for 3 months. Dr. Gordon Forbes can use the rest of that period, but, and this is very important, I have the final say. If at any stage I should say go, then it's go. Is that clear? Murray looked surprised. De Boer has official permission to dive here? He asked incredulously. That was quite the opposite of what Johnson had told him. Opperman nodded. Of course, Rob de Boer is a very good journalist who always does his planning thoroughly. He has written permission to dive here. This was amazing news, and it was on Murray's tongue to ask if he had official permissions for salvaging the gold too. If he had, it could cast new light on the whole issue. But something made him withhold the question. Did Opperman actually know about the gold? Well, then, Warden, thanks a lot. I am certain they will give you no trouble at all and help us to solve this mystery of Visagi's death. I foresee the diving to start tomorrow morning. He rose to his feet and paused at the door. Thanks again, Warden. Just one more thing, Lieutenant. Where do you fit in? The question startled the policeman. For a moment he stared hard at the older man. Nothing, he replied, his eyes softening again. Nothing, except the solution to Visagi's death. I hope so, Lieutenant. I sincerely hope so. The warden mused aloud after Murray had left. There was a faint stirring of doubt and uncertainty in his mind. He summoned Cathy to his office. The wrecker lay quietly in her berth next to the small wooden jetty, looking impressive in the descending afternoon sun. The 45-foot cabin cruiser appeared deserted when the white Mercedes-Benz sports model pulled up ashore. Auburn hair waving in the light breeze, Selena Nodius graciously emerged from the car, thoughtfully removing her sunglasses, and then walked with short, determined steps along the jetty. She paused at the gangplank, glancing along the deserted deck, shrugged and crossed on the cruiser. Delicately holding her glasses in one hand, she followed the dark companionway, but found everything quiet and lifeless. But she knew Will Stein would be aboard, probably sulking in his cabin. The rest of the crew had assured her when confronted in their usual hangout in one of the local pubs, and he would be very morose and well on his way to inebriation. Selina paused at her cabin door, took a deep breath and pushed it open. In the half-darkness, she saw him slumped on his bunk, an empty bottle lazily rolling with the motion of the cruiser. He glanced at her with dull eyes. Will had not shaved for 2 days, nor did he eat very much, for the guilt rested heavily on him. His self-respect was gone after his participation in the blood and carcass episode. He had isolated himself and drank too much. Will loves the sea, its freedom, its mystery and peace. Naturally, he adored diving and swimming, and his job was all he had ever dreamed of. Diving, swimming and living on such a luxurious cruiser, mostly at sea, the sun and wind. Wreck diving enchanted him, but never in his 5 years of diving for Gordon Forbes did he ever have to do anything unlawful. In a way, he had come to trust his employer over the years and believed in his good judgment. Now he had ordered this insane deed, and he was a willing participant. It was only after the terrible implications that dawned on him that he was overcome with disgust and a growing contempt for his boss. Daar sê, dit is dan dit vir vanaand. Ons gaan môre aand weer aan. Ja, daar is omtrent nog so 'n derde van hierdie boek oor. Nog 'n entjie om te gaan voor dit klaar is. So jy moet jou aand geniet. Dankie dat jy like, subscribe, share en die belbutton druk.